Apple Bay, or Life on the Planet, by Paul Williams. Copyright Paul Williams, 1976. Part 3. Chapter 24. Rebecca at this time was very pregnant and close to no one. Loneliness was breaking her heart and souring her disposition. She was giving me grief about how I was treating the cats. There were 11 cats at the time, and I was constantly tossing them out of the galley. She made me feel like a monster. I couldn't stand cats all around getting into everything, but I couldn't stand Rebecca's dirty looks in my direction either. It got so I couldn't stand being in the galley. But it wasn't just cats. Everybody noticed it. Rebecca was a constant, heavy presence, an unbearable weight of unvoicable pain and hatred. No relief, no relief. She went so far as to threaten to kill the unborn child. At one time or another, each person in the community unselfishly offered himself or herself to her in any capacity she could use him. Every person but one. To no avail. Her spirits never lifted. She felt like she would sink us all. For 2 years, Rebecca, a Capricorn, lived with Sam, beautiful, silent, thoughtful Scorpio, in Montreal and Vancouver. Sam likes to work with wood. He'd be a great carpenter if he wasn't such a perfectionist, and Rebecca likes to work with animals. In Vancouver, she was a secretary to a veterinarian for a while. Before that, she had a job with a traveling circus, caring for the wild beasts. Her best friend was her 6-foot boa constrictor. Rebecca and Sam gave Alan and Tammy and me shelter in a van when we first traveled north. 4 months later, Carol Ann and I found them living in a communal house somewhere else in the city. A friendly, motley collection of working freaks and students, dominated by an energetic, fat Aries from New York named Jean. Jean and Sam took some tabs of acid their first trip I'd smuggled from across the border. I made love to Rebecca. She got pregnant. Jean stopped eating meat. He used to come home every afternoon and do in 2 pounds of hamburger before going back to work. And the whole community, Sam, Rebecca, Tom, Jean, Steve, moved to the country, a place in the interior called Salmon Arm. Carol Ann and I went to the North Country. Carol Ann had loved and did love Sam, little knowing how soon we would all meet again. Rebecca, I believe, seduced me, or maybe we seduced each other. Who knows? Whoever knows? When I tried to remind her to use her phone, she looked at me, yes, and didn't. I could only assume some part of her wanted my baby. Or wanted a baby, and didn't want to put the whole burden on Sam. Who knows? Who really knows? Rebecca and I didn't get together again sexually until November, at which time we were simply trying, with some success, to make friends. And she told me, just after my fight with Hank, she was thinking of going to Van or New York or Montreal to have the baby, and I told her she had my support wherever she felt she should be. I felt so good toward her then. It was after all the bad vibes, cats, etc. The deep mutual trust that lay under our hostility was showing through. She'd moved to Apple Bay in the summer, after Carol Ann visited Salmon Arm. I wanted her then. Oh, that bright afternoon on the water, motoring in faith to pick up mythical white-huge billy goat Frisky from his exile on Ermine Island. Rebecca in the sun facing me, bare breasts swollen by pregnancy. Me so lusty and shy, knowing she wouldn't have me, loving her anyway. But she didn't encourage me nohow. But she told a visitor who asked about her belly that she thought the baby was mine. Chapter 25. I think the baby is Sam's, but maybe I'm just defensive. Sam and Rebecca broke up when they moved to Salmon Arm. Rebecca moved to Apple Bay in August, and Sam, who had no intention of getting together with her again, followed suit in September. The bastard. Chapter 26. What happened next is hard for me to put in words. I felt stymied, helpless. I couldn't talk to Hank. I couldn't be an active part of the community in almost any way, cutting wood for the galley, working on the boats, without coming into conflict with Hank. A conflict that could go nowhere, that had already briefly crossed the line into absolute noise, and now simply hovered on the conscious edge at almost every moment. Hank and I, together, were facing the abyss. I firmly believed that there was nothing either of us could do, that it was up to the rest of the community to pull us back, to find a way out, to open new channels of communication, to save us. The community. Who? A group of people with something in common, conscious or unconscious. I wanted a conscious community. I wanted people to admit they were trying to live together. I had demands to make. If you admit to each other you're trying to achieve self-sufficiency in food production, you can ask, even insist, that everyone do his best to contribute to the garden work. You may not get results, but you feel free to ask. I wanted to ask help for me and for Hank. I believe we'd reached a point where we were no longer able to live together and that everyone was involved. I was told by my friends that this was a personal matter between me and Hank. What else could they say? No one knew what to do. Okay. But I felt bitter. I needed help now. I muttered that there was no community and retreated to my cabin, where I spent the next week eating dinner by myself, cutting wood from my own stove, fleshing sheepskins, and rendering beef fat. I was pouting. I believe the target of my withdrawal was Stan. I wanted his aid and attention. As long as business went on as usual, I wouldn't get it. Hank and Dennis went to Bent for about 4 days after the fight in the teepee and weren't seen again for weeks. I stayed in the house in the woods. Chapter 27. What can I tell you about Stan? He represents some sort of absolute in my universe. 7 planets in Aries, pure I am. He is. To the visitor arriving at Apple Bay, he looks like the wild man of Borneo. Electric hair, bright, burning eyes. He's a hard worker, forbidding, friendly. Tornadoes of despair and ecstasy roar through him all day long. He is as tortured and honest and true as any man I know. Stan and I have big, crude souls, and big souls are naturally suspicious of each other. I don't think there's room here for both of us. We circled each other cautiously for 6 months, colliding slightly now and then one day sitting over the bluff over the Malaspina, watching 1,000 amazing seagulls holding a fish and love convention in the water below us and the air above. Those incredible swoops of 100 pairs of wings leaving the water all at once. Bright sunlight, acid autumn afternoon, we confronted each other and embraced. Incredible meeting, holding on for dear life, married forever. Great strength needs great strength, because great strength is great weakness, uncertainty. Stan and I, just knowing the other makes it all a little bit more bearable. Misery loves company. Who stands alone stands together with whoever else stands alone. And inevitably, there is nothing more romantic and glowing than the vision of a great, crude soul community, outcast behemoths, locked in conflict and love wrestling with superhuman strength and weakness towards some imagined greater good. This foolish, naive vision brought me to Apple Bay. It motivates me now and always will. I want to live with my own kind. I want to cavort with creatures who will understand me. Why am I barred from my native land? I'm not. I'm here. This is it. Chapter 28. The next thing that happened was I called a meeting. I issued a challenge. Carol Ann came by to visit and share my dinner. I hadn't eaten in the galley for over a week, not since the fight with Hank. And as she was leaving, I asked her to tell everybody that if they really wanted to try and make a community out of this mess, they should come to my cabin now and talk it over. I waited, and they came. Jean went home to the A-frame to sleep. But everyone else, Stan, Rebecca, Carl, Judy, Carol Ann, Steve, and Sam, Hank and Dennis were in the city, Annie back east, and Tom and Jan were visiting kinfolk. They all showed up at the cabin in the woods, curious and cheerful after pizza dinner and a moonlight walk through the snow. I didn't know where to begin. I just started talking. Talked about the I Ching hexagram holding together, the union, which I'd received again and again at that time, till I couldn't ignore it or misread it any longer. Holding together brings good fortune. Inquire of the oracle once again, whether you possess sublimity, constancy, and perseverance. Then there is no blame. Those who are uncertain gradually join. Whoever comes too late meets with misfortune. The unyielding lines hold together because they are influenced by a man of strong will in the leading position, a man who is their center of union. Moreover, this strong and guiding personality, in turn, holds together with the others, finding in them the complement of his own nature. Oh no, I said as I read these words again and again, not me. I'm not going to be a leader. I grew up believing the sublime truth is, don't follow leaders and watch your parking meters. The corollary of that truth is, don't lead followers. What the hell was the I Ching trying to do to me? Quote, what is required is that we unite with others, in order that all may complement and aid one another through holding together. But such holding together calls for a central figure around whom other persons may unite. To become a center of influence, holding people together is a grave matter and fraught with great responsibility. It requires greatness of spirit, consistency, and strength. Therefore, let him who wishes to gather others about him ask himself whether he is equal to the undertaking. For anyone attempting the task without a real calling for it only makes confusion worse than if no union had at all taken place. Ay. I was sitting alone in my cabin, climbing the walls. I knew I couldn't get away with it. The part of me that wants to lead is the part I've always had to repress most carefully. But the last paragraph of the commentary on the Judgment, hexagram 8, holding together, the I Ching, or Book of Changes, as translated by Richard Wilhelm and Carrie F. Baines, was what finally trapped me. If a man has recognized the necessity for union and does not feel strong enough to function as the center, it is his duty to become a member of some other organic fellowship. Somehow, I read that 100 times without thinking about it. I was sure what it said was, if you don't have what it takes to be a leader, you've got to support whoever can take the responsibility on himself. Strange, self-serving misinterpretation. Now suddenly I looked again and couldn't believe my eyes. This book was trying to tell me that whoever perceives the need for union must himself function as center or else leave the community. Organic fellowship, what a perfect description of Apple Bay. No choice between acting and remaining passive. Just act or get out. Go somewhere else where ultimately I knew I'd be faced with the same impossible decision. I was bubbling over with confusion, frustration, and hope. I'd been alone in my cabin 8 days. I wanted people to say, what can we do to work this out? I was on strike against the family, but no one seemed to notice. And finally, I played my hand, not knowing what I would say, but desperate to let it all out finally. I couldn't leave Apple Bay. I'd sworn to be there if I was the only one left. Nothing can grow here if we're all secret transients, so I had to try to pull it all together somehow. I wanted to cry, but pride wouldn't allow that. My riff was that we had to make some kind of commitment to each other. I couldn't believe that the conflict between me and Hank was simply a personal matter between the two of us. Because if it was, we'd had it. We were just going to go on hating each other for a long time to come. My only hope was that the community, who's that? Is there a community? Would see that neither Hank nor I could go on living at Apple Bay unless the rest of the people we lived with could somehow bring us together by loving us or shaming us, or I could see the strength was there to do the job, but not the authority. Hank and I needed to be disciplined. Who would dare? The authority could only come from a common, clear agreement that we needed each other, that living in Apple Bay meant living intimately with every other person living at Apple Bay. I wanted to know, are we ready to marry each other? If not, what are we doing here? It was awful. It was incredible. It was a storm that came flooding out of me, engulfing my friends and neighbors. I talked about leadership. The leader in any given direction is the person who's out in front in that direction, who's furthest into the unknown territory. It's simply a question of courage. And courage comes from need. Each person leads in those areas where he feels the need strongly enough to find the courage. If the leader falls behind, then he's not the leader anymore. It isn't an elective office. I don't remember much of what was said. I remember I got all tangled up in the metaphor of an army. An army on the field has to hold itself together or it hasn't got a chance against the enemy. The enemy is the unknown. We're on the front. Apple Bay is the front lines of the battle. And at any given moment, you're either in my army or else you got to lead the army yourself. And I'll follow gladly. The word army was a hard one for people to swallow, though. Many of us had been active in the peace movement, had even fled America to get out of the army. I guess I was purposely making it difficult. I don't know. I don't know what I was doing. I swear it was all completely out of control. This wasn't my conscious mind speaking. But I felt every word I said. It was scary. Commitment means no barriers to intimacy. Commitment means you have my full support in everything you do. If I don't like what you're doing, I'll try to stop you. But once you've done it, it's as though I did it myself. I take full responsibility for all your actions. And no barriers to intimacy means just that. Means you can and must feel free to make any demands on me that feel right to you. This commitment we make to each other right now gives you the right and the duty to do so. And then I asked each person in turn, telling you this story now, I feel both pride and revulsion. The same doubts and convictions that were killing me then are still at war in me today. Stan, are you ready to totally commit yourself to each and every person in this room? Stan had been the most vocal of the 8 of us, myself accepted, that evening. His response, his objections, made it possible for me to shape my thoughts and the energy in the room into words. Yes, he replied. Judy, Carl, Carol-Ann, Rebecca, Steve, Sam, Paul. 7 eyes. Slow, uncertain, full of pain and fear, but eyes nonetheless. An incredible statement to me of the courage and need and strength of every person there. The real community beginning to show itself. And one nay, strong and honest, no anger or resentment, Sam, who'd been saying for months that he wanted to live alone, who kept making plans to live at Redonda Bay or Stone Harbor, but kept ending up hanging around. Sam announced that he'd been waiting to see what would happen, whether Apple Bay would become more or less of a communal situation, and that he'd already decided that if we were going to require more commitment of each other, that wasn't really what he wanted right now. Who knows what any of it even means? Everyone went home to their separate cabins, exhausted, spent, to sleep it off and see what would come in the morning. Chapter 29. Who, we? Me, Carol-Ann, Carl, Judy, all come from different places, maybe similar, moderately affluent white North American families. Hank was an exception, raised in an orphanage, and Steve grew up in England. Post-war boom babies. None of us raised as fanatics. Most arrived at age 21 with nothing to believe in at all. No faith, no nation, no steadfast code of morals, no way it is or way to live, no nothing. Drifted or fled to Apple Bay and found a tree, a mountain, a person we liked, and stuck around. A place that moved our hearts. I think so. But different for each person. I don't know. And believe in each other? Why should we? I hope that we did. How can I tell you what it's like to walk from the well to the hill house? The path is often muddy. Fir trees on both sides as you leave the well, then an opening on the left, the little bay. Rocks and ocean, good place for oysters. The path narrows as you go up the hill. No one around but ocean and trees and the dirt underfoot. I get the feeling that my life is fulfilled just by standing in this place at this moment. It's too good to be real. It's completely real, and I just keep walking, even annoyed at the weight of the buckets I'm carrying, but elated. Look at the trees. Am I really here? So happy. Holy spot. The mountains in the distance. I mean, every moment you're at Apple Bay, you're under the influence, no matter who you are. You just can't get away from it. Up in the morning and through the sunlight forest to the galley. Gene wants to argue with me about commitment. Like a fool, I let him. He never did make a clear statement. Yes, I totally commit myself to this group of people, or no, I can't do that. Just lots of talk. He's as wordy as I am. He says he totally committed himself in the past to Rebecca, Steve, Tom, and Sam at Salmon Arm, and I was betrayed. I say if you truly commit your heart, you cannot be betrayed. He says he understands what I'm talking about much better than all the others who went along with it out of fear or hope or something, and proceeds to talk for weeks on end on any feeling that might have existed into oblivion. I try to resist the bait, but follow down the primrose path anyway. Oh, damn our minds that are so easily intoxicated and forget we're only here to speak our hearts. Restraint was never my strong point. Like any day, we cut wood, milk the goats, mess around the land doing what needs to be done, and come together at nightfall to eat. After dinner, Rebecca mentions that she's going to leave us soon to have her baby. It's no news to me, but Stan in particular was shocked. I think that at the core of his private vision of community was the idea of having and raising our children here. Rebecca's pregnancy spoke for the reality of our situation, and her leaving speaks as a kind of failure. We don't see ourselves as a summer camp. Despite what went down between me and Hank, we see ourselves as the last outpost of sanity, the only real hope for Western civilization. The city, the dominant culture, the way everyone lives in North America, is such a palpable, unspeakable terror to most of us by this point, Stan especially, that only our faith in our own ability to live independently separates us from the abyss. Stan knows nothing about childbirth, but he's scared. Even more scared of not having the baby at Apple Bay. Now that he's decided to go through with it, then he was scared of having it. So he passionately argues with Rebecca that we can do it. It'll be perfectly safe. There's nothing to fear. It is true that a baby was born at Apple Bay 2.5 years earlier. Harold's son, and all went well. Everything has happened at Apple Bay at least once. Stan is wrong. Childbirth is dangerous. And in the winter at Apple Bay, there are often days when it's too rough. Ocean, sky, for even the Coast Guard to reach us in case of an emergency. Not that we'd have a radio to call them in with anyway. Somewhere inside me, I must have known all along that Rebecca would never have her baby at Apple Bay in the wintertime. But we were innocents, and maybe fools besides. The argument raged on, and then Stan said, "It's because of Sam that you want to leave, isn't it?" It was my turn to be shocked. I thought Stan was crazy, but Rebecca said, "Yes, you're right." Chapter 30. I guess I never really noticed how much Rebecca was in love with Sam. The love other people feel for each other is not something I know much about. But my own past love encounters are perfectly real to me, and now suddenly I remembered what it's like to love somebody who doesn't want you but won't go away. You go to a party and there she is and you say, no, I've got to get out of here. But you see her face and she smiles at you and says, "Hi, how are you today?" Just sweetly enough so that the hope comes back no matter how hard you fight. That goddamned hope that won't go away as long as you can see her, and she'll give you even a moment's attention. Won't go away until you find someone else and you don't want anyone else when you see her face. Oh, rejected love that you can't stop offering is the worst form of torture, and it goes on, humiliating and bittering, and here are Sam and Rebecca, already in van they'd come apart. Rebecca living with Jean for a little while, and then to Salmon Arm in the summer. Rebecca in early pregnancy, looking at Sam's beautiful features every day, but he won't touch her. And maybe they try, but fight all the time, I don't know. I only know she was a great source of tension for everyone there. And when Carol Ann needed a break from Apple Bay and me in late June, she visited Salmon Arm and came back with Rebecca and Jean, who decided they wanted to live at Apple Bay come fall, once the garden at Salmon Arm had been harvested. Rebecca and Sam had already resolved to go their separate ways, so she was finding another place to live, and both Jean and Rebecca obviously wanted to escape the people they were living with. Rebecca made her move, selected a new home on this earth for her and her baby-to-be, she was sure it would be a girl, and moved in August, before harvest, with her loom and her cats and her auto harp, started cutting up vegetables to dry in the sun, got together with Hank, and then along comes Sam. He's on his own trip into Meher Baba and Eastern stuff and wants to achieve some kind of soul independence and enlightenment. Just wanting to see Apple Bay, and he likes it. Decides he'll move here too. Good place to be alone, with friends nearby, and it just happens to be by coincidence the same spot in the globe that his ex-wife has found to begin her new life. And the rest of us think, God, people are crazy. But everyone likes Sam, so we're not about to discourage him. He's so serious and gentle-spoken, implicitly kind and hard-working, though everyone's friendships with him never seem to get beyond the glorious potential stage. Still, that's enough. It warms your heart to know he likes you, such a fine one. And his hard work doesn't come to much in terms of production. He's too much of a perfectionist. So I'm sitting in the galley after Stan and Rebecca's conversation about the baby had gotten around to Sam, and I'm beginning to explode with anger, which I pour in a stream of words, anger directed at Sam for being the traitor, but really anger at myself for being so stupid, so insensitive, so blind. All fall, I'd been so furious at Rebecca, even to the point of asking other people, what are we going to do with her? And especially annoyed at the way she was chasing after Sam and rejecting Stan and me after they both decided they wouldn't live together, and he'd made it quite clear he wasn't at all interested in the baby or Rebecca. Still, she did everything she could to get him, or at least upset him, and it upset all of us. No one could really get through to her. She wanted everything done for her, but she couldn't ask except to ask Sam, which was pointless, though he'd try sometimes, or ask us all in such a way that no one ever wanted to even look at her. Something about Capricorn women. They always want you to do stuff for them, but they don't know how to make you feel good about it. I don't know. Anyway, all the pain of those months of trying to push our community life forward past the obstruction that was Rebecca, like the obstruction that was Hank, suddenly for the first time I identified with her situation. Insecure, pregnant, tortured by the presence of a man she couldn't have and couldn't not love, and no way to escape that ever-returning hope, bringing ever greater rejection and embitterment and humiliation, and he knew it, the bastard. He knew she just wanted him, and he didn't need any of us, or wouldn't at that time admit to himself that he did. So why did he hang around? I just felt such empathy suddenly for Rebecca's predicament, and such hatred of myself for having fought her and hating her and never realizing, and knowing now it was my own attraction to Sam and ever-present empathy for him that had made me so blind. Oh, I was a fool, but it would be different now. A traitor, I should add, is an enemy of the spirit. There's a bit of traitor in all of us, and it comes out at different times. I see now that at the time of this story, our fledgling community at Apple Bay was furiously combating a veritable siege of invisible enemies. That combat was going on before I arrived on the scene, and has continued since my departure. No doubt it will always go on. It's part of the survival trip, just like the constant struggle to provide ourselves with food. To live in a place, you must do battle with the goblins there. They're your own personal goblins, but don't feel bad. Everyone has them. There's only one piece of advice I can give any community or any person anywhere. Perseverance furthers. Today, as I write this, the Apple Bay community is strong and beautiful. Tomorrow it will crumble and scream in death agonies and be born again. Someone's always killing themselves and everyone else with them. I love Apple Bay. You can take poison or jump in the ocean or slice off your thumb, but those demons will cling like crabs and barnacles. The next morning, I was engaged in a demon wrestling match. But first I must tell you more about the evening Stan and Rebecca were talking about the baby. It was like a cavern at night. People huddling on the wet floor, trying to get heat from the stove, a few kerosene lamps or candles, and gleaming eyes in the darkness. Those not preparing food would be mothering the stoves, sitting in a corner reading or playing guitar, weaving a belt or something. Activity. Then sit in a circle for the rush of dinner, inevitable high point, and lie back stuffed and exhausted, and after a while the talk would start. Some people would drift away, off to their own cabins to read or sleep. I don't think Sam stayed long this evening. He usually went to bed early. I distinctly remember Stan trying to persuade Rebecca to have her baby here, and me cursing Sam out of anger at myself. All took place by the stove at the far end of the galley, where we usually ate, away from the door. Then somehow we switched to the other stove for a new and more hopeful conversation. Rebecca was feeling better now, and Stan had relented, and we were coming together again, and maybe Carol Ann, or Judy, suggested Rebecca should have her baby at the farm in Bent, our sloppy sister commune, where we could all be together and on the land, but only a half an hour by road, not ocean, from the Harcourtsville Hospital if there were any complications. Rebecca thought it was a great idea. Since the baby was due in 6 to 8 weeks, Rebecca and some of us would go into Bent and see a doctor and make the arrangements as soon as the wind was right. Chapter 31. The next morning, Carol Ann and I were lying in bed, and we got to talking about Sam. I guess I said something about how, of course, Sam would be leaving us in the next few days. Maybe I wondered aloud what his plans were. Anyway, Carol Ann just froze on me. "What were you going to say?" I asked. Silence. She wouldn't tell me, and suddenly I had to know. I grabbed her. Her sulking turned to active resistance, hatred, and all of a sudden I was wrestling her to the floor, a drop of several feet. There was a moment of ferocious struggle until I gained control, then we both stared at each other in total shock. What? I had no understanding of what was going on while it was happening. I was just acting out of uncontrollable necessity, survival. But now mysteriously it all began to make sense. My instinct was to retreat from awareness back to safe confusion, but I couldn't afford to. This had to be cleared up. "You don't want Sam to leave." "Nothing. Don't you see that he has to, that Rebecca can't stay with us unless he does?" She understood, but what upset her was perceiving that I really intended that Sam should leave now, soon, in the real rather than indefinite future. He had been constantly on the verge of going for months, ever since he'd arrived, and I guess unconsciously Carol Ann, and how many others, had hoped that the situation would continue unchanged. No one wanted Sam to leave. This is what I saw. Carol Ann attacking me violently, physically. The only visible manifestation of that attack, my violent response. But what I was struggling against was real. I saw a demon that would oppose me in every possible way except openly. My only defense was to make Carol Ann see herself, see what she was doing, and take conscious action. Demons fear the light. I explained again the situation as I saw it. Sam had said he didn't want to live with us, didn't want to be a part of a community, did want to live alone. Whether or not he would ever act on his intentions, this was the direction he was facing in, and it was an obstacle to our coming together. Rebecca, in turn, did want to become a part of this community, or so she said, and her ability to move in that direction was specifically blocked by Sam's continuing, indefinite presence. Furthermore, this was not an open-ended situation in regard to time. Every day the birth of Rebecca's baby grew near. She had to decide now where to have the baby. Last night, for the first time in weeks, she felt able to have the baby within the Apple Bay community, though not at Apple Bay. I assumed Sam would leave, and the change of mood and situation that had begun would continue. Suddenly this morning, I saw in Carol Ann an opposition to the spirit that was starting to possess us, a secret desire, out of love for Sam, to delay Sam's departure, backtrack a little, revert to the stalemated status quo that was sending Rebecca to Vancouver or New York, and, in my eyes, destroying us. I believed, that if Carol Ann could see the demon that possessed her, it would lose its power. The battle would be won. I fought, I pleaded, and she made me feel like she understood. I insisted then that she personally go to Sam and ask him to leave on the first boat sometime in the next few days. She said she would. The vibes that day were strange. I saw Sam later in the galley and asked him if Caroline had talked with him. He said yes, and yes, he would leave as soon as possible. He didn't seem angry about it, but neither was there the open flow of understanding between us that had existed at times in the past. Later, much later, many months, I found out that Caroline had told Sam she was afraid of me, that I was crazy, and she was afraid some kind of physical violence would take place if he didn't leave right away. It was Judy who told me this in the merry month of February. It was a mortal blow. Oh, the 1,000 deaths of the man who believes himself misunderstood. Do you understand me, dear reader? Do I? This business of demons, at any given moment that we feel something strongly, I believe, we also feel its opposite. And sometimes it's a very close margin that determines which side you're on. Hank often said, while I was in California, when that man comes back, I don't know whether I'll hug him or shoot him. Good and evil, like love, only exist in terms of the situation. In the end, it cannot be said, if all human life is wiped off the face of the earth, whether this was a good or a bad occurrence. To me, any forces, covert or open, that opposed the coming together of our small community embodied the enemy and had to be fought. And I took it on faith that among those of us who agreed we all wanted to live together, with all that that entailed, that any opposition was covert rather than conscious and intentional, and had only to be brought out into the open and confronted to be put to rout. So I believed somehow, deep inside, that if I could only let Hank know how badly he upset me and everyone else, he'd want to do whatever he could to improve the situation. I was willing to take risks to combat our recurring self-image of impotence, our inability to bite through all our ego obstructions to union. But I was a lousy leader, too insecure. I'd no sooner make a bold move than I'd be helpless with worry that my friends and loved ones might not understand what I'd done. I've always been so afraid that people might think me a bad person. I end up talking too much and so concerned about what people think of me that I lose the sensitivity to the needs of others, which usually inspired me to act in the first place. Of course I'm bad. How can you be good in any active sense in a particular situation without being bad? How can you stand in the sunshine without casting a shadow on the earth? So I did what I had to do and felt guilty and defensive about it afterwards, and as a result more cut off from open communication with my friends and loved ones. And anyway, Sam did leave, and it was time to go to Bent so Rebecca could see a doctor. I wanted to go, and Carol Ann and Jean and Carl didn't want to at first, but there was no one else to skipper the Bounty. And anyway, maybe it would be good sailing weather, so Judy and Steve decided to come, and Stan suddenly really dug on the idea that we'd all go together and bring our scene with us rather than being a part of some other scene. It was a good feeling. When we got to Bent, we encountered the Quetzalcoatl, which Hank and Dennis had towed to Bent some weeks earlier with the intention of welding her hull back together. In fact, everywhere we went there were stories, to be exact complaints, about Hank and Dennis. They borrowed my truck and busted the gearbox. They brought all these people in a school bus from California here and then got really pissed when we didn't want them crashing, etc., etc. Apple Bay's wayward children were giving the place a bad name. Not for the first time, of course. In its 4 years as a hippie community, Apple Bay had harbored a lot of wild men. Anyway, it was one more problem of community, a particularly difficult one when you remember that we all loved Dennis and Hank and had a lot of sympathy with many of their shenanigans. The people at the farm welcomed us anyway, with some grumbling, especially from sharp-tongued Esther. And as I walked across the snow towards the old farmhouse that is the nerve center of that bizarre piece of property, Stan, who had already made it to the front steps or ladder of the house, let out a fantastic whoop of terror or joy. Shortly thereafter, a scrawny male figure came out of the dark and impulsively kissed me on the lips. Grand reunion. It was Claude of Claude and Andre. The last time I'd seen him, the day before they left Apple Bay at the end of August, on their way to an ideal community in France, I'd bawled him out, said the difference between us was he was looking for the perfect situation, and I was trying to create it. Now here they were, back from Montreal. The trip to France had never come off, looking for a boat and overjoyed to be back on the scene. It was good to see them. Stan was especially happy. In the morning, Michael, who lived on the Bent farm, went with Rebecca to the clinic in town, where they were told the baby could come any time now, probably within the week. Chapter 32. Gung-ho Michael, whose energies ran hot and cold, but who had unquestionably emerged as the dominant male personality at the farm. During his depressed periods, everyone else would get depressed too, waiting around for him to rekindle his energies and be leader again. Michael took an immediate great interest in Rebecca's case. My ideas of searching for a midwife collapsed as Michael, who had been a medical student before dropping out, and Rebecca convinced each other that the best thing would be for Michael to deliver the baby, with everyone else present, there in the big house at the Bent farm. Michael dug out his old textbooks and started reading up on what to do. The rest of us looked around for work to do, replenishing food stocks, washing dishes, the day-to-day necessities. It was the beginning of December. There were only about 5 people living on the farm at this point. So we were not so much visitors as an invasion. The house started moving to our collective rhythm, the Apple Bay vibe, a very strange vibe indeed. For the first time in our lives together, we were apart from the ocean. The farm, also known as the Funny Farm to Esther and Michael's annoyance, was several miles in from the ocean. It had different weather from Apple Bay and had a very different spirit. And we were all caught off balance. We had come down to visit Bent, to take Rebecca to the clinic for a checkup and plan for the coming blessed event. We expected to return to Apple Bay en masse after 2 or 3 days. When the clinic doctor said the baby could come at any time, our plans were turned upside down. Clearly, it was time to just focus on the moment, commit our energies to the farm, and just wait for the babe to arrive. So we did little chores, talked to each other a lot, and tried to adjust to this new reality. But, as always, it seems, the flow of events didn't give us the chance to relax and get it together. Dennis arrived. Dennis, sweet, earnest Dennis, who grew up on a pig farm in northern Alberta, was loved by all of us and never really blamed for the shenanigans he and Hank got involved in together. Dennis was the follower on the Hank and Dennis team. Young, innocent, enthusiastic. The stuff he tried to do didn't always work out, but his foolish grin afterwards couldn't help but win your heart. Dennis and Hank had been in Vancouver and somehow got together again with Annie as she passed through town. Dennis and Annie, twin Sagittarians, became lovers in Van. And though Hank had encouraged them, according to Dennis, relations between the three were badly strained afterwards, and Dennis ended up hitching north alone. He was surprised to find us all at the farm in Bent, a normal way station to the trip to Apple Bay. He was also surprised that Hank and Annie, who left before him, had not arrived yet. Hank showed up alone later that day. The farm at Bent was in a large clearing, a space broader and more level, more open, more exposed than anything at Apple Bay. Coming in from the dirt road that connected the farm to the main drag, you'd walk a couple of 100 yards on a bumpy dirt road driveway, unevenly lined with apple trees. Large garden on the right-hand side, surrounded by a picket fence that I'd helped construct during my month in Bent the previous spring. But straight ahead, dominating the view, was the big house, the farmhouse that all previous owners of the land had lived in, so large in our homemade cabin-accustomed eyes that on a moonlit night it could have been the mansion in a Gothic novel. The front door was on a porch 6 feet off the ground. The front steps had vanished sometime in the last 10 years, and you had to climb up a cedar pole ladder to reach the porch. Deliveries through the back door, please. Through the front door was the main room of the house, a huge space with 2 wood stoves, kitchen on the left beyond a partition, the whole area clearly destined to be the center of activity for any main event at that farm. It was in this room, with all its carnival-like little circles of human energy, that the tension between me and Hank again exploded into open conflict, this time engulfing the whole community, as I'd always hoped and feared it would. Now Rebecca was in the back room, in the big bed, talking to Michael and maybe Steve, a scientist by inclination. He was starting to take an interest in the unfolding physiological drama. To do him full justice, he was also a guitar and recorder player, and there were musical forces of the heart, at work here too. I was in the big front room, and everyone else, Claude and Andre, Hank, Dennis, Jean, Carl, Judy, Esther, was mostly there or in the kitchen possibly. Stan and Carol Ann were upstairs in the large attic and sleeping loft. I was treating my crabs. You know, once you finally admit to yourself you have them, you have to go and buy some of that A200 or K-Well or whatever and pour it on all possible places, and then wait 15 minutes or a half an hour before washing the vile stuff off again. Of course, it's harder to do when you live on an island and haven't got a neighborhood pharmacy. Almost everyone in Apple Bay had crabs at that time, or had had them recently. One of those family illnesses that people in a closed circle just keep giving to each other. The following winter, we had a terrible, unshakable collective case of staph. So I admit it was a kind of an antisocial activity to engage in the living room, but you have to remember, we didn't have any bathrooms or running water. No, not at the farm either. And it was dark. It was almost always dark in December in Canada, and cold and wet outside, and I had to pick out those damn dead insects, and so I just mindlessly headed for the brightest kerosene lamp that didn't have somebody using it, and got to work. Hank called me on it. Hey man, why don't you take care of your fucking bugs somewhere else instead of here where your brothers and sisters are? I mean, getting angrier with every word, his voice getting louder, everybody's turning to watch. If you really cared about the people in this family, man, you wouldn't be throwing crabs around in this room where they can jump on us and give us your disease. Okay, I said, buttoning my pants, turning to go. But you know who brought those crabs to Apple Bay in the first place. Well, it was true. Rebecca was the known source, the first to have them and then admit it, months earlier. They'd clung on to one or several of us in rotation ever since. And that had been after that month she and Hank were together. I was turning to go and he grabbed me. He punched me in the face and broke my glasses. I grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground, but then he threw his weight on me and got me down, and I don't know what would have happened next if Carl hadn't somehow physically intervened, forcing us apart, placing his body between us. The air in that room was so heavily charged I thought it would blow apart. Suddenly all energy focused on Carl. It was clear in his face that he felt what I felt, that somebody was going to get killed tonight. Maybe me, maybe him, maybe Hank or some other person, if we couldn't get this energy under control. He was terrified. But Carl is the sailboat captain. It's his gig to be cool in the face of terror. I remember one time those 15-foot waves. Carl looked at Hank and said, after a slight pause, hoping tempers would cool, Hank, this thing between you and Paul, Carl very thoughtful and tense, do you think that there's any possibility it's connected with some sexual conflict? Absolutely not, said Hank. This man, he started toward me again. Carl stopped him. I flinched. They were about evenly matched, but I don't think Hank could really throw his whole energy into fighting Carl. Like all of us, he just respected Carl too much. And anyway, his fight was with me. I was the demon, his personification of all the frustrations of Apple Bay life, the man who, if only I would disappear, everything would be blissful. So Carl stopped Hank and told us both to sit down, completely, asses on the floor, don't get up, don't start toward each other, so we can have an uninterrupted talk. Carl is still between us. In the exchange of accusations, Hank starts toward me again, and I shout, Stan, where the hell are you? So loud the rafters shake, and that's where he is, upstairs in another world, asleep. Doesn't know what's happening, and my scream curdles his blood and infuriates him. He comes running down the stairs. What happened? Why did you shout at me? I tell him that something very important to the community is happening and that he should be here. How can I tell him then that I'm just scared shitless and want his body there protecting me and his soul making sense out of this madness? Well, it's pandemonium. Seems Jean has been talking to Claude and Andre all day about this crazy power trip I'm on, scaring everybody into saying they're committed to my army. So while Carl is interrogating Hank in his patient, unyielding way, and Hank is professing a complete inability to understand what he's talking about, I never feel any sexual jealousy toward any of my brothers and sisters, man. Bullshit, suddenly sharp and strong from Dennis, of all people. First time he's ever challenged Hank in public on anything. But then when Carl asks Dennis why he said that, Dennis gets lost in a lengthy monologue that never seems to come to the point. While this is happening, Claude and Andre are saying that I'm Charlie Manson, and Stan, still upset, is warning, your army's going to desert you, Paul. And I'm hiding from Hank behind Carl and arguing with Jean about commitment again, the meaning of commitment. And you'd think the craziness would just ease into a group orgy of laughter at ourselves for being so silly, but instead it just goes on, incredible tension. Maybe because we're in a strange house, separated from our cabins, and especially our ocean, our place. Or maybe because there's this underlying dissatisfaction in all of us. None of our egos is exactly getting massaged in our isolation the way we each like. I'm done with my shouting. But when I was shouting, it was loud, violent, terrified, and terrifying. Hank, Carl, and I have all felt the crush of angry flesh against flesh tonight, and nobody knows what to do with the fury, the confusion, the energy now. Stan has been dragged in forcibly. He doesn't like it. Some are ganging up verbally on Hank, some on me. It's a free-for-all, and talk about family brawls. Not many blows fell, but it was one of the most violent nights of my life. I really can't try to recreate the details, who said what. Too messy, too embarrassing, horrible. I don't want to remember. Carl went into the whole thing of how Hank and I had both been involved with Annie. Hank denied to him point blank that he had felt any jealousy or uptightness toward me when Annie suddenly stopped living in the teepee with Hank and then moved in with me. His denials were absurd. They strained credulity and gave Carl a chance to experience some of the brick wall frustration I'd felt earlier when I thought I was Hank's friend trying to talk to him and get through to him. I just wonder, I'm afraid to guess at how frustrating my own obtuseness and refusal to open up was to everyone around me who cared about me and who just wanted to get through. I know I hid behind walls of fast talking, the idea of myself as good guy, and my own complex, personal, largely unknown to me and obvious to everyone else, barriers to intimacy. I thought I was hot shit. Later, I thought I was just shit. Period. The truth lay somewhere between those two extremes. We were all trapped in that house together. No cabins to retreat to. And it was raining, of course, raining hard. It always rains in December in that part of the world. And now even my spare pair of glasses were broken. One lens smashed when they fell, no focus possible anymore. This mad, beautiful, horrible passion and conflict, this violence, went on for more than 3 hours, maybe 3 years. We're so far apart in so many places, I don't know how we ever dreamed of community. And it was still happening, hatred and distrust still pulsing in the air. The situation truly hopeless, when Michael came in from the back room to ask us to shut up and tell us that in the midst of all this shouting and madness, Rebecca had gone into labor. Chapter 33. Annie made it back from the city the following morning. Rebecca by this time had moved into the front room, sitting up on a mattress with a pillow between her and the wall. Steve was at her side, timing the contractions, which for 12 hours had been coming frequently but not regularly. The result being that Steve had a sheet of paper covered with recorded times and durations, but betraying no real progress to the knowledgeable eye, the first of many such sheets. And most of the rest of us had had little or no sleep, high on anticipation and drowsy with disappointment. Michael conferred with Rebecca on her right, while Steve clocked her on the left. Michael had his obstetrics text in front of him almost all the time, reading frantically, like a student cramming for a final exam. I hadn't seen Annie for a long time, and we had a lot to talk about. We didn't get to it right away, what with her saying hello to everybody and both of us getting involved on and off in Rebecca's non-stop drama. But eventually that afternoon, we found ourselves sitting on the floor in one corner of that big front room, watching a pot of water boil on one of the wood stoves and talking about what had happened to me and her since last time we met and touched. And then Hank started menacing us. Privacy is the most important thing in any communal situation. At Apple Bay, we always had our cabins to retreat to be alone with someone or just to be alone. But until the baby arrived, until we could leave Bent and go home, we were condemned to a goldfish bowl existence, seeing too much of each other and being seen too much by the others. And there was nothing we could do about it. There were 15 of us in the farmhouse, doing all our living in 3 or 4 rooms, going outside during the short daylight hours to work or walk around, but unable to go far from the house for fear of missing out on the birth, the main event. 3 months earlier, we had all been together in the orchard at Apple Bay. 2 nights and 3 days of joyous partying, bodies falling over bodies and never getting out of each other's sight. More than a dozen of us at that time, too. That was so different, though. We were high on harvest time at that time, and the sudden sense of community, joy at being together and making such fine music, and being able to get all our needs from the trees and garden right there, baking our own newly dug-up potatoes in a campfire under one of our cherry trees. We'd run to our cabins to dig out recorders, flutes, guitars, barrels that could become drums, and run back not to miss any of the action. It could have been like that in Bent, too. All of us together without much immediate work to be done. Certainly we all thought of the coming of our first collective child as a time for celebration. But there was stuff in the air that was just too heavy to overcome. Me and Hank had kind of spoiled things for everybody from one way of looking at it, though there were plenty of other frustrations and tensions around that might have surfaced more noticeably if the 2 of us hadn't stolen center ring. In this corner, weighing 129 pounds... On the face of it, a boxing match between Hank and me was pretty ridiculous. Me scrawny and inexperienced at physical confrontation, Hank 50 pounds heavier at least, a muscular veteran of foreign wars and, doubtless, childhood street brawling. Hank never got violent, except those times with me, but he did throw his weight around. It was inevitable, just as I used my powers of verbal persuasion unhesitatingly to try to get what I wanted, without hardly even thinking about it. I had forced the original confrontation with Hank, in fact, because I found I couldn't reason with him. He was such a master of evasion that finally just getting him to admit that there was a problem seemed a major satisfaction and victory. Not that I thought this out, you understand. I just followed my instincts and frustrations, wholly convinced at age 22 that honesty is, after all, always the best policy. And those impulses of the heart or whatever led me straight to this present disaster. So now it was the afternoon of Rebecca's first full day of labor. The smell of death that had hung over us during the last night's tense hours of communal confrontation had vanished almost as soon as the labor began, to be replaced by the far less dreadful anxiety of a room full of expectant fathers and mothers, all expecting the same child. We were impressed, delighted. Here we all are, wishing we could just split this awful scene, and here comes the newest member of our community, just eager as hell to climb out of his safe spot and get in on the action. Can't wait for the scheduled due date. My family needs me. I'm going out there. So last night's atmospheric pressure had dissipated, but here's just a touch of it coming back, like a cold gust from an open window somewhere, as Hank comes in and starts showing off his new banjo, borrowed from someone in the city, a little more loudly than necessary, not too far from where Annie and I are sitting and trying to talk. Okay, well, we get up pretty soon and go upstairs. It's a whole other world. You can't hear what's happening downstairs, and they can't hear you. Maybe one or two other people are up there already, but that's okay. We sit down together on the right-hand bed, way in front of the room. Pretty soon we're snuggling under the covers, aroused, but also just so relaxed to be holding each other again. Hank comes up the stairs, playing his banjo. He comes over and stands by the bed. Butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Annie gives him a weak hello, trying to pretend we're all friends and everything's cool. I ignore him, pretend to ignore him, but it's suddenly very difficult for her and me to touch each other. He looks out the window, walks around, plays a few chords. I just thank the Lord I have this banjo. Silence. He says it again. I just thank the Lord I have this banjo. Fondling it. Isn't it beautiful? You don't know how lucky you are. He sits down on the edge of the bed. Annie is between us. I'm totally panicked and warrior cool at the same time. I don't want to get killed. I don't even want to fight. I'm not dressed for it. I look at him. Annie starts talking, courage born of desperation. She's trying to reason with Hank, but underneath she's really saying that she loves us both and just wants to tell us it's all right. We should relax, get to know each other. What she's saying is straight from the heart. She doesn't understand why this has to happen any more than we do, but unlike us, she's not blaming anybody. I decide I've got to try harder, got to get out of the rut I'm in somehow. I look at Hank with truce written in my eyes, real vulnerability. I reach out my hand toward his, very slowly, like he should take my hand. He looks at me. Maybe there's some uncertainty in his face, too, but he doesn't make a move. So I bring my hand closer to him. I touch his arm. Don't touch me! Don't you ever touch me! His words are so vicious, his recoil so instant, so violent, like I was a poisonous snake. All the fury just pours back into me, and I jump out of bed, half naked, out of my mind at this latest rejection, and run downstairs, screaming at the startled group some half-coherent demand for aid. If anybody cares anything about this family, they should do something right now. Oh, the pain. The words are barely out of my mouth, the head still turning toward me, when Rebecca shouts back from her maternal bed, "Get out of this room! I can't stand any more of your shit!" And her hatred in her voice is so absolute. A new wave of anger floods over me, anger at Rebecca for not understanding, and I'm on the brink of shouting back at her when I realize I can't do that. She's the one we're all here for, and there's just no way I can stand here and argue with her. The very fact that she had to open her mouth is devastating. I let out a small cry and turn and run down the hall to the back bedroom and throw myself sobbing onto the bed. I can't remember if anyone came in to see me. I just lay there till the hatred drained away. It did. It does. It always does. We never believe we'll recover, but we do. I got up quietly when the time came and went out to see what was happening. The front room was fairly quiet, a small group around Rebecca following the progress of her irregular contractions. Cautiously, I started up the stairs. Stan and Carolyn and Steve and Annie were sitting and standing with Hank at the end of the bed, and he was telling them how he felt about his life. I'd never seen Hank so open with anyone. He was crying. He was beautiful. They all were, pushing him to say more, but in just the right way, and about me. He explained how I'd been the one who originally invited him to Apple Bay, his respect for me off in my cabin writing. I thought the world of that man, he said. I thought the world of that man until he started coming down on my shit. They couldn't see me standing on the stairs. I listened for a while and understood some things I'd never confronted before. Hank's awareness of the violence in himself and his mortal fear of it after Vietnam. I remembered now that the people who'd been at the Bent farm in June had called him Killer Hank, and he hated it. He thought he was safe, becoming a hippie, smoking a lot of hash, and embracing the doctrine of love and peace and communal living. That teepee was really a comm center for him, a vital symbol, purity and warmth. And then he finds himself suddenly involved in a physical trip again, me shaking him and punching me out right there in his teepee on an acid trip. It was like the devil had entered in his life, a devil the rest of us knew he carried around with him and made use of in human relationships every day, but he didn't know it, he couldn't see it, still couldn't believe it. That was my idea of community, realized at last, the 5 of them talking together, pushing through to Hank's reality, no matter how painful and difficult the effort. Because in order for him and them to live together, they had to be able to see him as he saw himself, and he had to see himself, however briefly, as his neighbors saw him. He'd been asking for it, begging for it, when he ran away and came back, when he threw the dishes out of the galley, when he badmouthed Jean and Steve in front of the rest of us, when he broke up with Rebecca and cursed the female race. He wanted to be able to share the things he couldn't share, a familiar paradox. The more aggressive he acted, the more defensive he felt. His unconscious just dreaming, hoping against hope that if he could just provoke us enough, something would happen, i.e., we'd all gang up on him in a friendly way and show him that we knew just what he really was, and, a miracle, to show him we all loved him anyway. Home at last. Hopes and fears, buried in an idle swagger, a persistent, mysterious chip on the shoulder. And Hank is just the most outrageous case, but we were all doing it. Me for sure. Others less intensely, but the need and the fear are always there. I can't let you see what I really am because then you wouldn't like me. But oh, I wish. Such a bunch of loners. Not just at Apple Bay, of course, but all over this human planet. Anyway, what I saw at a distance was incredible enough to make me cry too. And I did, going back downstairs, not wanting them to see I was listening, not wanting to fuck up the communication. And if only it could have spread somehow, that committee of elders taking each of us children one by one, hearing our stories, breaking us down in public, and letting us feel that love, a committee of the whole, each elder in turn becoming the wayward youth who gets to confess, let go, be helped, who isn't allowed in the face of such solidarity to pull all his usual tricks. Oh yeah, I longed for it, but no happy endings. We moved toward community an inch at a time, one day at a year. And after that wonderful inch is traveled, we're still 1,000 miles apart. I went downstairs, and Rebecca's labor had stopped. It started again late in the next morning, but by that time, Hank and Annie and Dennis and Claude and Andre had left the farm and were on their way by fishing boat back to Apple Bay. Chapter 34. Day after day, Rebecca's labor continued, and we stayed in that house in Bent. I found myself thinking now and then about how nice it would be to take a nice little vacation in California. Hit the road, see some friends, check out my old stomping grounds. It was a daydream. I didn't take it very seriously, but the thought persisted. We looked for things to do. We had to fill up our days and our nights. Stan and Judy played some recorder duets, and once that did turn into magic, a room full of people singing chorale parts from Handel. The other times the spirit wasn't there. They needed Rebecca's soprano, and of course she was always either sleeping or in labor. Gene sat on the floor at night, flailing at a guitar and singing Dylan songs with real fire in his voice. But then that stunning energy would turn in on itself, and he'd bore us with endless kvetching about wishing he could just walk down the road right now, late at night, and find a place to buy a hot dog, something to eat. Gotta get that gratification. I sat in a corner near a kerosene lamp, rereading Heinlein novels, Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers, holding the books close to my face because I no longer had any glasses. Stan read Krishnamurti. Rebecca was knitting. The 4th day, the 5th day of labor passed, and Jean finally wished us well and left to go visit New York City. Lack of sleep was taking its toll on Michael, and he snapped at everyone in sight. We all felt restless. We were out of our normal environment. Apple Bay is a world apart, cut off, easy metaphor for the planet. Nothing but naked, terrifying, natural beauty of the place, and ourselves staring us in the face every day. Bent, a few miles away, is something else. The end of the road, but also part of the road, connected to the planet and its civilization. We were confronted by the continuing self-destruction of that world every time we visited Bent. I mean, like one of those afternoons in Bent, the sun came out, after days of wet, gray weather, and Carl and Esther and I followed an old trail back through the alder patch and into the woods and arrived several hours later on the other side of the Bent Peninsula. It was a fine excursion, nothing like a walk in the woods to reaffirm what it's all about, sunlight falling through cedar branches. But when we got near the water, we saw logging had started, beautiful young forest becoming stumps and orange mud and tangled waste one more time. It hits you hardest when it's a place you've been before, a place you can't help remembering. All that alive, peaceful beauty and violet, bam! One day when you walk down the trail after a few months away, it's gone. 30 years growth. There was nothing to say. We held each other and talked as always of ways we could fight back, but 6th day, 7th day, false labor or whatever it is, there's no end to it. I was spending a fair amount of time with Esther, an Aries lady, dark-haired, small, intense, 18 years old. We were a young group, Hank the oldest at 29, Carl 25, most of us 21, 22, 23. Esther lived at the farm and seemed to be the main person taking responsibility for the place, more than Michael. She spoke her mind to the rest of us. She liked to talk, and she and I would be the last ones awake at night, talking about courage and loneliness and self-reliance. I was drawn to her face and spirit. We did make love, and it was good, but it was the late-night talking that meant the most to us, I think. Exchange of spirit, mutual respect, and the fierce satisfaction of a little understanding at last. Carl was surprised and somewhat disappointed to see me getting it on with Esther. He'd been watching her, too, wanting to get to know her. He told me this the morning after she and I became lovers, and I don't remember if I said anything, but I know I thought he'd be a fool to stop courting her. Anyway, I slept alone that night. They got together, and we all three felt good about it. The next day, we went for that walk in the woods. Carol Ann spent most of her time with Stan, and I rarely saw her. I guess she was avoiding me after that business with Sam, but I didn't think much about it at the time. Few of us could think about anything. We were just waiting, believing our normal lives would resume any day now, and then we could straighten things out. And Stan. Stan hadn't wanted to come to Bent. He never likes to leave Apple Bay, and it had actually been 2 years since he had been as far away as Vancouver. Stan had faced death repeatedly at Apple Bay. Once he was attacked by a bear. Another time he got a near-fatal overdose of vitamin A from the liver of an old codfish. He survived, but the skin peeled off his entire body 4 times in 2 days, while he lay nearly unconscious with fever. Stan faced death repeatedly at Apple Bay, but the fear he felt there was something he could live with. The terror he felt when he went near a big city was something else again. It wasn't that he lacked experience. He was a city kid, used to teach high school in Harlem. But Stan, like the most of us, only more so, had a phobia about civilization, quote unquote. He couldn't deal with it any longer. Like Carl, like me at the time, like everyone whose destiny drove them to Apple Bay, he suffered in the city from an acute case of painfully heightened awareness of what's really going on, also known as paranoia. So he liked to stay home. And with the single-mindedness only us madmen and women experience, he dedicated himself to living self-sufficiently, worked harder in the garden and around the land than anyone, a living example to all of us of what we could hopefully become if we dedicated ourselves to the work in body and spirit as much as we all did in mind. Stan, more than anyone, acted out the lifestyle we all believed in. He did it like his physical survival depended on it, because in his mind it unquestionably did. Plant those potatoes and carve that axe handle because it's that or jail or the nut house or the army or maybe something far, far worse. Not that Stan didn't love his work. He did. But he was also a driven man, driven by his own fearsome sanity. We admired Stan for working harder, more steadily than any of the rest of us. Well, Carl also worked with awe-inspiring energy and dedication, but in bursts, not every day. But we loved Stan for something else, his vibe, that sanity. I know he often felt confused and insecure in his head, but oh, the electric Aryan strength in his movements and actions. Stan's presence at Bent, his uneasy patience at the long wait, long separation, was the most certain symbol of our communal commitment to Rebecca. He couldn't have been happy. He'd come for a 3-day trip, and it had been close to 2 weeks since he last saw Apple Bay and his friends the goats. But he'd made the decision about what was important, and by God, he was seeing it through. 10th day. California dream keeps coming back to me. Michael's seeing germs everywhere, turning the farmhouse into an uptight hospital. Stan and I don't like it. Medical caution is one thing, but how can all this anxiety be conducive to a safe and happy birth? What do you know about it, says Michael, and Stan and I look at each other. This tension's not healthy for babies either. We're all getting a little crazy. Carl knows some people about a mile down the road, and he thinks they might have some grass. So Stan and Carl and I leave the farm briefly to go get stoned and relax a little, just for the good of the community. We sat and talked with those people for a couple of hours, and it did take the edge off. There was a little smoke, but it was mostly getting out of that farmhouse, that room, that made us feel so much better. Chewing the fat with people we didn't really know, about world events and so forth. What a relief to be away from all that, waiting for the baby scene and all the heaviness of our communal relationships. But just for a little while, there came to be a moment where we all knew it was time to go back, and off we went, walking along the highway, feeling good, talking about this and that. When we got to the corner of the road that leads up to the farm, it's paved for the first few 100 feet, then gravel, finally just becomes dirt. There was some sort of commotion going on. Closer inspection revealed various people from the farm, talking to someone who'd just driven up in a pickup truck. It was Jerry, who lived in the next house along the road. They'd just come back from the hospital, him and Judy and Michael and Steve, after driving Rebecca in. It's a boy! Rebecca had a boy! Wow. Seems that right after we left, the real labor started. No water, but the contractions suddenly began coming so fast and so strong that Rebecca got scared. She asked Michael to get her to the hospital, and he did. Car didn't work, so they had to get a ride with Jerry. It takes about 25 minutes to drive that winding road into Harcourtsville, where the hospital is. And the baby was born less than 30 minutes after they arrived at the hospital. Rebecca and her baby boy were both fine. Rebecca still knocked out from the drug they'd given her, and no one could stay with her at the hospital because of hospital regulations. Visiting hours were over, and none of us was her legal relative. All this news was coming so fast, out there at the intersection of Highway 1 and the farm road, clusters of excited people standing around on the pavement in the dark. I just felt happy that it had happened at last, and that everything was all right. New baby. How could she do that? I turned to Stan, his voice still thundering in my ear. His face was twisted, teeth clenched, eyes burning. The disappointment that I was just barely beginning to feel, that after all this, the child was born in the hospital after all, away from us, had come out in Stan in an instant, absurd rage. He couldn't contain himself. He cursed Rebecca, stamped off into the night, turned and came back, demanding to know why Michael had let her do it. I hadn't seen Stan so angry since the day one of the goats got into the cabbages 3 times. And here he was again, crazy in the street, shouting at Rebecca as though having the baby in the hospital was something she had done to him, to spite him, and he was never going to forgive her for it. He was like a lover betrayed. I tried to talk to him, and he listened, but my words had no impact. He wanted to kill her. Something inside him just went absolutely wild at the notion that the baby had been born in their hospital instead of our house. It was a defeat too bitter to be accepted, a defeat he wasn't ready for. He just stood there by the side of the road, roaring like a lion and shaking like a leaf. He had reason enough to hate that hospital. His ex-girlfriend, Lulu, had an IUD put in the spring on a clinic doctor's advice, and by the fall the thing had caused an infection in one of her ovaries, which had to be removed, and somehow the other ovary had been damaged in the process of removing the first one. But beyond that particular unpleasant memory, there was, I guess, burning in Stan the unquenchable need to do everything ourselves as the only way to escape from the death grasp of civilization and the world of technological North America, with all its oppressions, hypocrisies, and, more than that, its madness, that desire for apocalypse, for violent self-destruction, that Stan for one had decided he was going to have no part of. We have to be free. And that means free children most of all, born into a pure world that is inhabited only by nature and by us, free of all those outside horrors. It was so clear to Stan that she had been waiting for him to leave, and that made him furious, paranoia. He was right, of course, but somehow he couldn't see the other side of it, that his ideas and needs were repressing her, creating the need for the imagined safety of the hospital. If he and I and Carl hadn't left, then labor might have never stopped. It had dragged on so long, so impossibly long. Stan said that Michael copped out. He should have told her not to worry, calmed her, made her feel confident in him, not given in to her panic. Yeah, but I realize now how good it was that Michael didn't do that, didn't stand on false pride and desire to prove himself, and instead at the last moment turned the case over to people who did feel sure about what they were doing. Stan, after 15 minutes, was almost in tears. Judy and I put our arms around him, then walked back with him, in silence now, back up the road to the farm. Chapter 35. So Rebecca's pregnancy was over at last. The next afternoon, Carl and I tried to hitchhike into Harcourtsville to see her and the baby. Everyone else had gone to visit in the morning. We figured we'd wait until the later set of visiting hours and avoid the crowds. Besides, someone had to clean up after breakfast. Carl and I both hugged Esther at the farmhouse door, then walked off down the driveway. We never got our ride. There's just one road between Bent and Harcourtsville, just one road of any kind that goes out of Bent. We've both stood on that road many more times than we care to remember. Harcourtsville was the scene of our infrequent shopping expeditions. 200 pounds of feed wheat to go, please. We were so used to hitchhiking in Harcourtsville, there's always someone coming from the pub, heading for a shift at the mill. We had 3 or 4 hours before they'd even let us in to see her. We'll be there early even if the hitching is slow. The hitching was very slow. One of those days when everyone seems to have stayed home except you and a couple of other stragglers who are not the sort who'd ever give you a ride. We walked while we waited, just to keep moving, imagining that the guy who would get us into town was even now idling his car in a driveway just around the next turn of the road. We were joined by a neighborhood farm dog for a few miles of our walk, then she turned around and left us alone again. After a couple of hours of this, we began to get anxious about whether we'd get to the hospital on time, but there was nothing to do but go forward. Sometime after dark, a car finally stopped. We were already in Harcourtsville. We'd walked 15 miles. With minutes to go before the end of visiting hours for the day, we drove the last mile and a half to the hospital. At the desk, they told us we couldn't see her. It took a few minutes to get everything straight, but basically the story was this. Hospital rules allowed only members of the immediate family in to see the mother the first day after childbirth. They'd already stretched their rules to let Michael and Steve be designated official family, since Rebecca had neither husband nor parents nearby. But 2 people, 2 names on the list, was their maximum. They weren't going to stretch the rules any farther. And when we pointed to the blisters on our feet, the woman said, of course, that she didn't have the authority. All she could do was check our names against the list. Okay. Could we see the baby? Yes, we could. Straight through there and take the elevator to the 5th floor. Oh, alien environment. It had literally been months since we'd been in a room with an electric bulb. We rode up inside that machine, just dreaming of our child we were about to meet, he whom we'd labored so long for, fleshly symbol of our wilderness family. We were adults now, not children, on the edge of some new, hoped-for new age. They wouldn't let us touch them. I don't know what I expected, but coming out of that elevator and standing in front of a pane of glass, looking at Gabriel a few feet away on the other side of the glass, not even open space between us, hospital muzak playing in the background, I just fell apart. I looked at the baby, but I couldn't see him. Only a shape in the distance. No glasses meant I had to be close to see anything. Through the thick glass window. And anyway, you couldn't communicate with babies by looking at them. You hold them. You let them feel you. Maybe he did feel me. He moved suddenly, turning toward me. I could see that. And suddenly I felt he was trying to reassure me. I was freaked out by the environment, but he was cool and just wanted to tell me that it didn't matter. Nothing could separate us. We are flesh and blood energy creatures, feeling each other's presence, and all this other stuff is insubstantial, meaningless. I did feel better. Carl motioned at me that it was time to go, and I waved to Gabriel. There was no one in the hall, and I suggested we find Rebecca's room and say hello anyway. But to my surprise, Carl dissuaded me. He said someone would come along, and it would just be a pointless confrontation. I had a difficult moment accepting what he said, but I knew he was right. Strange role reversal. Carly usually the first to challenge civilized authority. On the boat, we were pirates, and he was our captain, but here he was telling me, no, don't try it. We rode down the elevator in silence. Out on the street, beyond the hospital grounds, walking along a sidewalk with weeds and trash and a chain-link fence to our left, highway to the right, I felt the world fold in on me. I was at the center of a big collapse, worse than death, an overwhelming sense of emptiness and loss. Carl reached out to me and urged me to talk to him, and I told him what I'd felt in the hospital. The muzak, the carpeting, the glass. It was the triumph of the lifeless world. We weren't ready to have our own children. For all of our love of the trees and the ocean, we were still trapped in this steel and plastic prison. I wanted to die. I just wanted to hold Gabriel. I looked at Carl, and I could see he'd been through the same kind of doubts, and now he no longer felt them. Somehow, somewhere, in the last 24 hours, he'd come out on the other side. I remembered then what Gabriel had seemed to try to tell me, and the two of them together, Carl and the baby, pulled me out of that dead place. It's all right. I believed them, almost. Carl said, come on, let's go get some coffee, and led me to a pizza place around the corner. We sat at the counter, and my sense of self came back to me, and I shrugged off the weight of the world. We were both very tired. Carl knew a guy in Harcourtsville who'd lived at Apple Bay once and who now had a small apartment near the reservoir where he sold grass to the local teenagers. We called him, and he said we could crash on his floor. We had to walk another mile to get there. The guy was selling ounces, which he stashed in hiding places outside. No dope in the house except a joint or two to taste. Every 5 minutes, somebody would come by and go through in an elaborate charade of friendly chatting about nothing much. Money would change hands almost invisibly, and our host would tell his customer where to find his particular purchase, next to a tree out front or whatever. Eventually, I went to the other room, played some records, and went to sleep. Morning. We hitched back to Bent. Annie was back with news from Apple Bay. Hank was there too. We ignored each other. The news was that the dogs, Strider, Ruff, and Wolf, apparently hadn't been fed and were real hungry and cold and had attacked the goats, gone wild, a dog pack. I'd already decided in my heart that I was going to California. Their description of Apple Bay, the snow had melted, the front of the galley was all mud and garbage, sounded so desolate to me, so strained by all our failures, especially my own. I couldn't imagine going back there yet, isolating myself with this family again. I wasn't ready. There has to be a time for retreat. We're not superhuman. My decision was confirmed. Stan's reaction was just the opposite. He wanted to get back to Apple Bay as fast as possible. Steve and Esther said they would take care of Rebecca and baby Gabriel when they got out of the hospital. Rebecca had said she wanted to stay at the farm for a while. We all had a good night of lovemaking and music and farewells. Judy and I got together at last, and the next morning Stan and Annie and Carl and Judy sailed to Apple Bay. I went south, feeling free. I didn't think about all the things that had happened. The word community never even crossed my mind. Chapter 36. That's not the end of the story, but I'll try to keep it brief now. I went to California and returned 2 months later, December 15th through February 15th, and in between had 1,000 adventures. My best friend threw me out of his house. I hitchhiked 1,800 miles and lived for a month without spending a penny. I made love to a number of beautiful women, lost my head and my heart, and finally found myself on top of a mountain on 1,000 mics of acid, diving into a fresh mountain stream off the snowfields on the 2nd of February, and persuading my friend Pete, who wasn't stoned, to jump in with me. And when I got back to the border, they wouldn't let me in for love or for money, even though I'd cut a few feet off my hair, and I had to hike through the woods at night in the pouring rain from Nation X to Nation Y with a French-speaking road who'd been turned away with me. And I made it to Apple Bay at last, and lasted 2 months of the most intense loneliness and frustration yet. I ranted and raved and schemed and loved and hated and finally threw in the towel and went to New York City. I mean, how can I remember the details? Carol Ann didn't know me anymore. We had moments of joy, but more of pain. She couldn't help me. Hank and I had hoped we'd been friends again, but somehow we were more antagonists than ever. I'd walk in the galley, he'd be sitting in the corner, and the whole place would just start shuddering. The vibes were so heavy. He was living with Judy now. She told me she still couldn't understand about Sam, why I'd made him leave, and though she told me lovingly, it made me hate her for a moment, and I told her so and hurt her deeply. Rebecca never returned. There were more actual fights between me and Hank, once when I was talking with Judy and he thought I was bothering her, and incredible conflicts with this newcomer Don, who'd moved into my cabin and wouldn't move out, and had decided practically before he even met me that he hated my guts. I spent a lot of time pruning fruit trees, that was nice, and baking bread, no place to sleep. Only Stan could help me, a little. He somehow knew what I was going through and gave me all the support he could. He was honest and true to me and himself. I had hassles with Jean about Annie. Annie was my friend too in those dismal days, but there is no cure for what ailed me, not at Apple Bay. All Apple Bay could do was knock me down at my insistence, and it was another community on the other side of the continent that kicked me in the head and completed the task, saw that I was on the bottom and knocked me through the other side so I could start the long crawl up again. I have no complaints. My friends always give me just exactly what I ask for, and what more can you ask than that? Chapter 37. One more story I forgot to tell you. When I decided to go to California after the baby was born, Carol Ann wanted to come with me. I said no. It was hard to do, but I knew it couldn't be any other way. I have to have my freedom from all this, and I didn't have the strength to support Carol Ann in the matter to which, in some earlier life with me, she'd grown accustomed. I don't know. I just liked the idea of being alone, and so off I went. She said maybe she'd do some traveling too. So I'm walking down the street in Seattle, decide to hitch back to my father's house, and who picks me up but these people from Bent on their way south, and they just given Carol Ann a ride to Seattle. So they drop me and her at Dad's house near the lake, and later that night I'm lying on the sofa bed next to Carol Ann, but miles away, just trying to go to sleep. But somehow she doesn't let me get away with that one. She somehow, without really even saying much, is making me feel guilty as hell. And I'm thinking, hey, come on, lay off. Just don't expect anything of me and it'll be okay. But the pressure keeps rising, and the next thing I know, I'm telling her for the first time ever, I don't like you. Go away. Leave me alone. I can't stand the sight of you. Ugh. I'm shaking her off like she's got me scared shitless. I just can't get rid of her without breaking our hearts. She's crumpling like a piece of paper, and it's my own sweet Carol Ann whom I love, and I'm never the same after that one. Though I'd do it again today. You've got to stop following me, damn it. Why? I ain't pretending I can tell a good story or create convincing characters. I never created a one of these people. They just happened to me. And every one is the best thing that ever happened to me in my miserable life. A miracle. But Carol Ann, you loved me more than anyone, taken more than anyone. I've always been so grateful and resentful, frightened to lose you and frightened not to. I could never tell you you weren't enough for me. I'm sorry. I love you. I don't understand how I just started pretending you didn't exist when I had something else to do. And it broke my heart to send you away. Your crazy hair and pale blue, huge eyes and delicate features, invisible lips so delicious for kissing, and slender, rich body, sweet breasts, one nipple different from the other. You holding me tight with such anguish, always, like I was about to die, and you leave me alone in the world, and all the brother and sister games, you an only child, and I never had a sister, but you make such funny faces. Anyway, I never wanted to lose these things. Once we learned how to love each other in bodies so incredible, often exploding with high-strung energy flares. You put me through some changes and loved me sweetly, but your limits just drove me bananas. I can't stand anyone's limits, and I toss myself in these turbulent rivers to destroy my own limits. It never really works, but it keeps me busy. But seeing you as an extension of me, I'd wonder why you couldn't love Carl better and hold us together, the four of us. But I don't mean to lay my trip on you. But what can I do but push my trip on you as far as I can and then push you away when I have to go further or have to run and hide? I don't know. Chapter 38. In the morning, I get out of bed and into the water. I swim. I'm alive on the planet. I don't believe you are any different from me. No, really. We're both just standing here. All this absurd stuff behind us and absolutely helpless and smiling in the morning sun. I am the spark that leaps. Apple Bay is an imaginary place, with no electricity and a small, rocky garden that must be dug up by hand. Lots of trees and mythical mountains and islands and ocean. Incredible weather. No automobiles or telephones or grocery stores or subways. No highways across barren, hamburger, bright, open spaces, but only paths through the woods. Beautiful young barefoot people carrying candle lanterns like some children's story, long ago and far away. Godlike, unwashed faces of souls too pure to exist anymore. Just a bunch of kids from New York City and California touched by magic, picking apples in the orchard where the rows of trees walk into blue, blue skies, prying oysters off the rocks, shoveling out the barn to feed the compost pile, hewing rails from a cedar log in the woods behind the back pasture. Nothing like this exists anymore. These people live in a dream. Somewhere, big factories cough out smoke, and newspapers report that wars are fought on mythical deltas, and television sets go wurra, wurra, wurra. But is it really any different anywhere you go? What are we doing here, Earth, Earth, Earth? Weren't we born in the stars? Yes, but we were carried away by slave traders to the Virgin Lands and put to work, fighting and fucking each other. No, I can't go on. Well, you got to, that's all. Oh, I get it now. It's kind of fun once you get the hang of it. Fucking and fighting and chopping wood and making dinner and eating dinner and smoking dope and work in the garden. Oh, I get it now. I never really wanted to work in the garden, but whatever you say, boss, I like it here. My sweet lord, I see you all over, under rocks and skyscrapers, on busy city streets. Just show me what you're doing and I'll lend you a hand, or sneak off in a corner and start a revolution. It doesn't really matter which side you're on, you just gotta work it out. Peace I like, war I like, sex I like. This is a book about life on the planet, that's all. I wrote it in my head in an afternoon, and I'm waiting for evening because Hank caught some trout in the lake over there, and Judy's baking gingerbread, and